Hello everyone. My name is Tani Haunga and I'm the minister here at Mount Albert Presbyterian Church. On behalf of the Bryant family, the Bennett family, and the people of Mount Albert Presbyterian Church, I welcome you here today as we celebrate the life of the very Reverend Margaret Martin, who passed away peacefully on Sunday, the 19th of August. Margaret, as we knew her, was a devoted member, a friend, and a leader in our parish. The thousands of people reached by our church Facebook message of condolence reveals the many lives that she encouraged, strengthened, and comforted throughout her ministry. I'm very honored to be here today as we remember her and reflect on her life. Welcome.
E te whānau au I hukaraiti, kia ora tātou. Greetings. Greetings to the special service of thanksgiving and celebration for the life of Margaret. She touched our lives in many ways, as a family member, a friend, a deaconess, a pioneering woman minister, a colleague, a leader of the Presbyterian Church, and as a member of this parish. We are grateful and give thanks for Margaret's long life of dedication to following in the way of Jesus, her service to others, to the church and the wider community. We have much to remember and give thanks for as we celebrate her life. A special word to Margaret's cousins, David and Jim Bennett and their families, to Margaret's Martin family, her granddaughters Kirsten Bevan and her family and Tessa Bryant. Kirsten and Tessa parents, Glenn, Margaret's stepdaughter, and Glenn's husband Ron visited and said their farewells to Margaret on Sunday afternoon before going away overseas. We remember Glenn and Ron as they will also be thinking of us. Glenn wrote to me on Thursday, "We are very sorry that we are not with the assembled crowd to celebrate the life of such a remarkable woman. Margaret did and was many things. She was an enabler. She loved putting people in touch with others who needed their skills. She had such a wide contact base that she could usually find the right person to solve the need. Margaret befriended many people who were at the end of their days. She visited them often and was a real support." Margaret was a trailblazer. In particular, her ordination as the first woman minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand, and then as the first ordained woman and second woman to be moderator of the General Assembly, sets her apart. No one else can replicate these firsts. But while we remember and honour Margaret as a person who broke new ground, we also remember the way in which she brought herself, her dedication, her enthusiasm, her many gifts to her lifelong commitment to the service of the Church and others. The present moderator of the General Assembly, the Right Reverend Richard Dawson, is unable to be here today as he is attending the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Vanuatu. He has sent this following message. Dear friends, the Reverend Margaret Reed Martin represents for the Presbyterian Church of this land a watershed moment in our history. Her ordination, in accordance with the Church's stated acceptance that the scriptural witness of the Christian Church was that women were to be admitted to every level of leadership and that their gifts and service were every bit the equal of men's, was the step required to signal our commitment to that which we had confessed together previously. As such, Margaret holds a pride of place within our church, which can never be denied or repudiated, and which should make every person of our confession proud. Furthermore, her ordination and work as a minister, and her election as moderator later in her career, serves as a continual reminder to the Church that what we declared together about women must not remain an historic confession, but must also require of us a continued examination of our life together and the place women hold in that life. That decision cannot remain something that exists in name only, but that speaks to our attitude and approach to women in every part of our life today. We have lost both a wonderful servant and a remarkable icon of our time, and it remains for us to remember all she has meant and will continue to mean to us, and to give thanks. I, your servant, do that now. May Christ have mercy on us all. Richard Dawson, moderator. We have 3 former moderators of the General Assembly present with us today that I'm aware of: Margaret Schrader, Andrew Norton and Pamela Tankersley. And I'm going to invite Pamela Tankersley to come and bring greetings on behalf of the wider Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Good afternoon, Pamela Tankersley, and I'm a past moderator of the Presbyterian Church, along with Marg Schrader, who's back there somewhere, and with Andrew here, and several others, of course, and I come speaking on behalf of those moderators, but more than that, on behalf of the whole of the church. Margaret, in fact, for me, has a whole pile of other connections, and that we shared upbringing in the same church in Wanganui, at St Paul's Church in Wanganui, though she was out at Westmere more often than not, I believe. And then also, when Margaret was working in Wellington, she was an attendee at St Andrew's on the Terrace, and in fact that was the place that she was married in the midst of us all one Sunday morning, with my beloved husband playing the organ with great style, as always. Another memory I have of Margaret is when I arrived in my first parish, which was in Gisborne. I had been there 6 weeks, and you might remember that there was rather a large cyclone called Cyclone Bowler, and the whole of Gisborne was devastated. Margaret came and stood amongst all the people and said, "How can we help?" She was moderator, and she saw that as her role. And I can remember very clearly taking her up to Tolaga Bay in the midst of the mud and the slosh and the ruined vines and the sheep who had drowned. And for her, that was part of her whole understanding of what it meant to be a moderator of the whole church in there. And I think about Margaret and the gifts that she left us as a church. You have spoken already, Helen, thank you kindly, of the things I might have said. Margaret, for me, was a woman of great courage. We always saw her with an extremely cheerful face and a great deal of enthusiasm. But I do think it was often costly to be the one standing on the edge saying, "Excuse me, but the women need to be included too." And the women who are here, the clergy women who are here, I know would join with me in saying very clearly, without Margaret, we would not have had that opportunity to have answered the call of God on our lives and be part of this church in the way we are now. And we are very, very grateful to her. The other thing I'd want to say that we are grateful for with Margaret was her very fine mind. Margaret was a great researcher. She had that innate Presbyterian sense of knowing that there's no point in coming to church and leaving your mind at the door, that we worship with body, mind, soul and spirit, and our mind is very much part of our offerings to God in that way. The research she did with the Research Association, of which she was, I think, the founder even, and continued on, has been a wonderful example of her lateral thinking. She took the culture as it was in her time and society and researched that. She took the church and she saw how those two things could and should be connected. And she was a teacher. So we all heard the outcomes of her research and her understanding. And that was another gift she made to the church, for which we're very, very grateful. I want to say one more thing about Margaret that might surprise you. I see that we have her down here as the Very Reverend Helen Margaret Aitken Martin. But in fact, from my memory, and Margaret Ann confirms it, Margaret chose not to be the Right Reverend or to be the Very Reverend when she was moderator. Again, she had this innate Presbyterian understanding that the moderator comes from amongst the people for a time and is called to an office, and when that office and that time is completed, they'll go back into amongst the people and they become one again with the sort of the priesthood of all believers that we understand of in our Presbyterian church. So maybe she changed her mind at a later date, but I know at the time she was moderator, that was made very clear to us that she was not going to be the Very Reverend or the Right Reverend when she was moderator. But I come again bringing greetings. Richard Dawson is certainly sad not to be here, and the Assembly Executive Secretary Wayne Matheson also sends his greeting, and I know I speak with the greetings and the love of a church that admired Margaret and treasured her as one of our very special taonga. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. I'll say a little bit more about the use of the very, which might just clarify that. There are a number of people who would have liked to have been here today but aren't and have sent greetings. Jean Cotter in Hamilton, who trained as a deaconess and was ordained in 1973. Jan Bell from Australia. Janet Aitken, a cousin in New Plymouth. Elizabeth Bills, currently in the UK. Graham and Barbara Wilson in Christchurch. Marie Temple and Alistair from Geraldine. Helen and Ross Milner, who are from Wellington but currently in South America. Joan Barton from Havelock North. Marjorie Dwieryhouse hoped to be here this afternoon as well. Marjorie trained with Margaret. They overlapped by 1 year in their training as deaconesses. I'm sure that she would want her greetings also said today. And then maybe if anybody can help Margaret Schrader get out back to a hotel near the airport after we finish today, that would be something Margaret would appreciate. Let us pray. In death we face the mystery of life. In the words of the psalmist, our days are soon gone and our life comes to an end. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, so that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Gracious God, as we worship here, speak to us through hymns, readings, prayers, and in the silence. May your blessing be on us and in our lives. As we remember Margaret and give thanks for her life, may our hope be strengthened, our faith be rekindled, and our love renewed. In darkness and in light, in trouble and in joy, in doubt and uncertainty, life is a gift, and we are grateful. Amen. We join in the hymn, Almighty Father of all things that be. Margaret was a very organised person and left clear instructions about what hymns we should have in the service and what readings we should have. And so I invite Tessa Bryant and then David Bennett to come and share the readings with us, and then invite those listed to come and share their memories of Margaret.
So this is Psalm 16, verses 6 to 11. How wonderful are your gifts to me, how good they are. I praise the Lord because he guides me, and in the night my conscience warns me. I am always aware of the Lord's presence. He is near and nothing can shake me. And so I am thankful and glad, and I feel completely secure, because you protect me from the power of death. I have served you faithfully, and you will not abandon me to the world of the dead. You will show me the path that leads to life. Your presence fills me with joy and brings me pleasure forever.
And Paul's words from the book written to the Romans. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or the sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long, and we are accounted as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And from John's Gospel, chapter 14, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to prepare a place for you. They who have my commandments and keep them are those who love me, and those who love me will be loved by my Father, and I will love them and reveal myself to them. Amen. Thank you for coming to share this time with us. And I particularly want to thank Kirsten, who was able to be with Margaret when the moment came for her passing. I tried to get on a plane from Wanganui, but the flight was full and Jimmy was 3 or 4 hours away, so it wasn't possible for us to get there. We only had about 3 hours' notice. And I want to thank Helen and the minister here, Reverend Tani. And of course I want to thank Bryce. Now Bryce has known Margaret almost as long as I have, so he got corralled into being the organist this afternoon. Margaret and I go back a long way. She was born 20 years before me, and so I didn't show it on the slides, but she and our maternal grandmother had a picture of me taken about 1944. The circumstances of the planning or lack of it around my birth are really a matter left for discussion over a glass of wine. But today is not about me. Just to say that, as we all know, Margaret had a very long and a very interesting and very rewarding life. But it was not always thought that this was going to be the case, for the family doctor who told her mother, "This child will not live to an old age," was clearly very wrong. The reason being that things were pretty grim in those days immediately after World War I, and in addition, Margaret had been born with tuberculosis in her knee. That was the reason why she limped and had a slightly shortened leg. They had frozen her knee at quite a young age. TB was widespread in the family. Our mutual grandfather's first wife had died of TB in the early 1890s, and one daughter from the first Aitken family was to die of the same disease by the age of 20. My own mother had TB after I was born and lost part of her lung. But to make matters worse, the older Reed family, who lived out in an area, if you know Wanganui, called Brunswick, had even more children about the time that Margaret herself was born. Now, this Reid family had arrived from Scotland about 1907, but they kept having children. One of the youngest children got lost on the farm and was never found about the time that Margaret was a very young child herself. As part of the search for that child, Margaret's father, James, actually got into the drainage pond from the milking shed and tried to check to see whether the child was actually drowned in the milking pond. He developed a chest condition and never recovered, and 18 months died of the same infection, possibly even through tuberculosis. So Margaret and her mother moved into Whanganui to live with our mutual grandparents, the Aitken family. Money would have been very, very tight, but our grandfather had retired as headmaster of Whanganui Intermediate School, and he was for a while a city councillor. Aunt Isabel was a school teacher herself, and so she probably did some hours because she had been teaching before she married. But Aunt Isabel was also searching for some way to have a solution to Margaret's TB knee problem. And she learned that in Switzerland there was a doctor offering a treatment. So in 1931 they all travelled off to England, the Aitken grandparents, my mother Enid, to see if this treatment offered any hope. The theory was that if you got the patient up a mountain above, I think, 3,000 feet or 3,000 metres, I'm not sure, and enjoyed the unfiltered UV rays, there was a chance of achieving something of a healing. However, after 6 weeks, Aunt Isabel took Margaret away and they went back to the UK and eventually came back to New Zealand. Now, a few years ago, 15 years ago, in fact, Marion and I took Margaret back to the same place. At that stage, she was just turning 80, and she was active enough to accompany us on one of our international business trips and holidays. We also took her to Assisi, where her late husband, Dave Martin, who was minister here, had been stationed during World War II. Now, that was a challenge, because to ease the mobility as we travelled around Europe, we had arranged for our daughter to bring a wheelchair over from England, so that Margaret could be transported with a set of wheels in most places. Now, at Assisi, she wanted to be pushed up a hill to see the Church of St. Margaret. Now, this was quite a steep slope, and as I recall, a stone slope, and such that it was impossible for the three of us to actually get up to the church. She was very determined, as you can remember and consider and will know. We were determined we were not going to push her up that slope. And in fact, we almost considered turning it around and letting us just run down. However, she did get there. We took the car up and went up, found a park up the top of the hill, and then came down the hill to the St. Margaret. So she was very pleased to have got to that church, not named after her, but of the same name. Towards the end of World War II, Margaret went to Otago University and studied to complete a science degree, and then went to Knox College to complete her Presbyterian Church deaconess qualifications. For some years in the 50s and the 1960s, she worked as a school teacher both at Whanganui Girls College, and then she did country service at Waverley High School, District High School. And in those years, I also remember her teaching us Sunday school. The one thing that I can remember from her Sunday school days is she really objected to the fact that Christmas was starting to be spelt with an X. That's the one thing I can remember. Margaret always had strong connections to a large number of our family relatives, and because she'd inherited some money from the family farm that, of course, she'd had to leave a long time ago, she used that money in a number of ways. She invested in a block of flats in Whanganui. She helped my wife and I buy our first home in 1969. Think about this, Auckland people, when a comparatively new home in Whanganui could be bought for $6,500, and later helped us when we actually set up our business, and she gave us the money for that. But all this had to be paid back, of course. Nevertheless, I'm sure a lot of you remember she lived on the smell of an oily rag all her life because she remembered what life was like in those early days. I will leave Jimmy to carry on the story, except to say that Auntie Marg, as the family call her, has been an inspiration to us all. She never forgot birthdays or Christmas. In the country church in Wanganui, where we worship today, it's the last church, or the only known church in the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand, to have been built and is still in use as a war memorial church. She was the first child baptised in that church, and shortly afterwards her father was the first person whose funeral was conducted from that church in 1924. And the memorial window that we put up recently as the church seismic job was done was substantially paid for by Margaret by contributing $10,000, as one of her uncles is actually one of the names of the people killed in World War I. And we remember that side of the family and that history every day in the church. Hers was an inspirational life lived to the full and in the service of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten. I was Margaret's granddaughter. She was always Nana to me and my sister Tessa. However, she called us varying things towards the end of her life, including step-granddaughter-in-law, which tended to confuse some people, but it was because she claimed to take no credit for our brains. She was pretty proud that we both became doctors, one a real doctor and one not. One of us has got a medical degree and one's got a PhD, and we'll leave you to determine which one you think the real doctor is. Well, not, that's a bit controversial. I'm a radiologist and Tess an archaeologist. It's my privilege to speak on behalf of my side of the family, Margaret's family by marriage. She married my granddad, Dave Martin, in 1978. I attended their wedding at St Andrews in Wellington as a 2-month-old. I might have noticed my little 4-month-old out the back, hopefully not being too disturbing. I'm glad to be here in Mount Albert. This church is a special place for our family. This is the place where my parents met, where they wed, where they grew up, where my sister and I spent our childhood Sundays, and sadly the place where we've remembered those we have lost and funerals. The foyer is also dedicated to my grandmother, to Grandma Dorothy. My mum and dad, Glenn and Ron Bryant, are unfortunately unable to be with us today. They're in Europe on a long-awaited trip, and sometimes timings don't quite work out. Before she left, Mum wrote a few memories for me to share. My memories of Margaret go back to when I was a teenager, when I shared a bedroom with her. She often stayed with us when she visited Auckland for work. My mother died at a relatively young age of 59 years. Dad and my brother David had a few years running the Mount Albert Manse and looked after Grandad, a retired high country shepherd who lived with them until he died at the grand age of 90. It wasn't until late 1977 that Dad and Margaret decided to marry, which they did in April 1978. I clearly remember Margaret telling David and I that she was not replacing our mother, but she was an instant Nana to Kirsten. Dad and Margaret visited Kirsten when she was only a couple of hours old, and they were there again in action when Tessa was born unexpectedly early 5 years later. Margaret and Dad jointly ministered to the Mount Albert congregation. Margaret and I did a lot of activities with young mothers, and those were the days of early family worship at 9:30 a.m. and weekend family camps. Eventually Dad retired, and they bought a house within the Mount Albert parish. Our daughters were lucky to have 2 sets of grandparents at church, and we all attended regularly. The girls talk about staying overnight at New Windsor Road and visiting Nana and Grandad on Sunday afternoons. Margaret gave Tessa her violin when Tessa started to learn to play this instrument and attended her student concerts. In 1987, we all travelled to Palmerston North when the General Assembly passed the appointment of Margaret as the first ordained woman moderator. Dad accompanied Margaret on her moderatorial journeys. They travelled around New Zealand and overseas. And as we've already heard about, I recall Margaret being very dismayed at the damage done by Cyclone Bowler on the East Cape. They had 3 weeks in Asia. They flew to Hong Kong, had Easter in Guangzhou, China, Taipei, Taiwan for a meeting in the Presbyterian General Assembly in Kyoto, Japan, Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, then home. What a busy trip. Time came for Dad and Margaret to move into a smaller house without the extensive vegetable garden which Dad had developed. They chose a unit at Rosehill Gardens. This was an excellent move. Dad did think it was a nice motel, but he asked when they were going home. But Margaret enjoyed the community there, and it gave her the support and interest she needed. Margaret had an amazing theological understanding and kept abreast of all the ideas which were evolving. Margaret and I went to several events, including a women's spirituality weekend, a Matthew Fox seminar, and Jesus seminar functions. I admired her breadth of understanding and enjoyed the interesting services she conducted. And as David's also mentioned, Margaret always remembered birthdays and anniversaries. They were always very important to her. She looked after Dad as his health declined and was always present and concerned about him. I was grateful for the love she showed him. When David died unexpectedly, it was Margaret who was contacted by the police when they had to break into his unit. She was wonderful at organising his funeral and offered to help clear out his home. This we refused, as it was a big task for the able-bodied. Later that year, Margaret assisted at the wedding of Kirsten and Rob. We were all absolutely delighted she could take part. Margaret liked to write. She wrote many histories and recorded the trips she took as well as theological writings. She even wrote the sanitised version of My Mother's Family and didn't reveal too many of the skeletons in the closet. As Dad had been an only child, he was close to Mum's family, and Margaret embraced them too. They continued to visit her after Dad died. As my brother-in-law commented recently, she was a wonderful woman. So Tessa and I also reflected on Nana and her life. She certainly saw dramatic changes in her lifetime. She was a true survivor. She survived TB in a pre-antibiotic era. I've already heard about her trip to Europe and Switzerland in an attempt to cure her, and especially being medical, I was always pretty fascinated at hearing about that part in her life. And Tessa actually did a school project about the time that she went and heard some interesting history from Nana, because certainly Nana enjoyed recounting memories, one of her favourite things to do. Nana embraced change. She adapted from a truly analogue age to the digital one we now live in. In the past, phone calls were very expensive. When we rang Nana from overseas, or she rang us on our birthdays, we were very lucky to get her on the phone for more than about 30 seconds. But in later years, she used to send us emails. One of my favourite early memories of Nana is her coming to get me in my new entrant class, picking me up from school to tell me I had a brand new baby sister. My children are very lucky to have known their great-grandmother, Grand Nana as she's known to them. She saw Freddie, now 5, develop over serial visits to her place at Rosehill Gardens. She had a special relationship with my middle boy, Donnie, who is now 3, after she met him at 1 day of age in hospital. She was in hospital herself and she came and met him in the maternity ward where I was. And even more recently, I was thrilled to be able to introduce her to my daughter Matilda. Even though she wasn't always very communicative towards the end, she had a huge smile on her face when Matilda was with me also. You were an inspiration, Nana. We will miss you, but are very proud of the life you lived.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Back in the 1980s, as I began my teaching career, schools were actively promoting the message, girls can do anything. I found it an easy idea to push because in my family there was a person who had already broken into the male domain. In these few minutes, I'd like us to reflect on the qualities that made Margaret the person we respected and honoured and cherished. Disability never defeated her. She actually turned it into a positive because it taught her to look for alternative solutions. Throughout her life, by continuing to seek those alternatives, she found ways to bring people together in spite of divergent views. This, I believe, was a hallmark of her work as Secretary for the Council for Christian Education and the Church's Education Commission, and certainly through many campaigns for minority groups she supported in later life. That spirit of togetherness, too, was used to great effect in keeping our family in touch. Our grandfather's second marriage meant that we had a network of relatives in the South Island, with whom, due to distance, contact was rare. Through the travel her work required, she re-established strong contacts. Cook Strait had a virtual bridge across it. And those connections are maintained still. Jan, our adopted sister, and I were particular beneficiaries of this as Margaret took us on a month holiday in 1958 to visit those relatives in the South Island. Jan told me this week she regards it as the best thing that happened in her childhood. What a memory. She could recall all kinds of incidents of life in earlier years, sometimes to the great embarrassment of people present today. Not looking at anybody in particular. She cared greatly for her extended family, the Aitken, Barton, Miller branches, and the Bryants, whom she regarded as the most wonderful step-family anyone could wish for. She was always interested in our endeavours and supported us financially when she could. By her personal frugal lifestyle, she managed to be amazingly generous also to a wide range of worthy organisations. The last time that I helped her with a tax return, it took the tax people down at the Newland Mall about 45 minutes to photocopy all the receipts. And what a writer. I learned only this week from our family's remaining nonagenarian, Janet Aitken in New Plymouth, that as young girls they wrote and produced little plays for Sunday evening family socials. We think of times before television, but this was times before radio. In recent years, Margaret spent much time researching and writing detailed histories of our parents and grandparents, full of insightful anecdotes, giving character to the people. So these were all great qualities. But I come back to how her disability became a positive. Overcoming the obstacles created by the disability required courage and determination, essential to one about to be the first woman to seek ordination in 1965. As has been referenced, we hail from a family of teachers, and she intended to follow suit. But the family lived in straitened times in the 1940s. The cost of going to secondary teacher training in Auckland was prohibitive. She had completed her BSc at Otago, and her interest in theology gave her the idea that by training as a deaconess at Knox, she could become a school chaplain. That was going to be her entry to school teaching. At Knox, because she had a science degree, she was allowed to do the full minister's training program, except for the course in homiletics, preaching, because the men said, you will never need that. At that stage, Margaret probably had no disagreement with this, but she was a visitor at the 1964 General Assembly when the vote opened the door for women to be ordained. A minister whom she had worked for as a deaconess tapped her on the shoulder and said, "You'll be the first." She dismissed the idea, but driving home back to Whanganui, her mother asked, "Why not you?" 3 weeks later, she handed in her application to the Wellington Presbytery. So continued a life of looking for new answers to the problems in society, for ways to change our patterns of thinking, often supporting minority groups. One of the strange quirks of late life too was her great interest in sport. She actually had put her best effort in as a schoolgirl, in spite of the disability, and given a little extra time to complete distances, certainly achieved those. I think in part it was with an association with Dave, who was a great follower of Otago rugby, that they became great watchers on television of many rugby games, and certainly Margaret and I had a great fascination with cricket. I'm a bit lost now because there's nobody else in my family who is a great follower of cricket. Not quite sure who I'm going to ring and compare the latest result with India and England over there in the UK at the present time. She loved those things, and it kept her certainly very alert and very aware. I understand from Kirsten even that in the last day she had netball on the television in her room. In recent years, still busy managing life of Rosehill Gardens, she was constantly sought after by congregations around Auckland to preach. About 5 years ago, she decided to limit how far afield she would go in response to these requests. And approaching age 92, she decided it was time not to renew her driver's licence. We were all in support of that. The problem was, she recognised there were a few dents in the car. People get too close to me. Yes. Then came the realisation, even last year, there came a call to conduct a service. There she was in Avondale Rest Home. Of course, yes. Then came the realisation, how? But she couldn't remember who had rung to make the request. Margaret, you made a huge difference. The doctors in Switzerland got it wrong about your length of life. Well done. Thank you for all that you did. We will treasure the memories. Kia kaha.
In her suggestion for her funeral, Margaret left a request that the hymn written by Graham Kendrick, Jesus Stand Among Us, be read. The reason for this will become clearer in a moment. The words of the hymn are, Jesus, stand among us at the meeting of our lives. Be the full agreement in the meeting of our eyes. Oh Jesus, we love you, and so we gather here. Join our hearts in unity and take away all fear. As to you we gather from so many different lands, Christ the life between us in the joining of our hands. Margaret's words in her funeral suggestions are as follows. It was while we were learning this new hymn in November 1977 that I decided I was going to phone Dave Martin and say, yes, I will marry you. I had not been able to say that 2 weeks before, but the hymn said, take away all fear, and gave other positive thought, so I acted the next day. As they say, the rest is history.
Margaret was somebody who loved telling stories. She had a great memory, and you would tell her something, and then she would have an anecdote that would be related in some way. Her face would light up, her eyes would sparkle, and if there was a humorous note, it would be this delightful chortle. I want to begin my reflections on Margaret with an anecdote, one of my own. I first met Margaret in 1976. It was the centennial of the Theological Hall in Dunedin. There was a colloquium in which Margaret took part. She shared insights into the still relatively new women's movement and feminist theology. For me, her presentation was an early part in my own journey in facing up to the need for a church and a society in which women and men share equally. Margaret, on this occasion, as always, was the educator, laying out the issues clearly, but concerned to take people with her. She was a strong person with deep convictions, but she was not a militant or radical feminist. Rather, she was one who lived out her commitment to inclusion, irrespective of gender or sexuality. For Margaret, the unity of the church was a given, something to be affirmed and lived. She was grounded in the Presbyterian Church, but she lived out her ecumenical commitment in the work that she did. Christ, in the words of the hymn, was the life between us in the joining of our hands. Margaret was the kind of person who made vital connections between people, among children, among women, between women and men, among people of different denominations and cultures. Her own life experience, as we've heard, contributed to that. Although Margaret was troubled by her damaged knee throughout her life, she had a great resilient spirit. She never complained. She just got on with life and engaged with people irrespective of labels. Comment has already been made about Margaret's groundbreaking role as the first ordained woman in the Presbyterian Church. In a way, ordination was something that she didn't seek, but in a way it sought her. After the long years of struggle, the largely male assembly finally agreed in November 1964, as we've heard, to the ordination of women. Being a first, a pioneer, is never easy, but Margaret's employment in the New Zealand Council for Christian Education enabled her to avoid some of the tensions and opposition experienced by the first women in parish ministry. She was not unaware of those difficulties, though. Her national role in Christian education, her year as moderator of the Wellington Presbytery, and then her election as the moderator of the General Assembly, meant that she had an extensive knowledge and experience of both the local and the national church. It was Margaret who led the group that commissioned Dr. Vivian Adair to undertake research into women in ministry, published in 1990 as Women of the Burning Bush. Margaret would be delighted that this research has recently been updated, although the fact that the first report reflected considerable pain, but very little, if any, of the identified recommendations resulted in any action, was a disappointment. Margaret would affirm the positive tone of the recent reports forward, that the opportunity for women to read and tell our stories strengthens our backbone and unites us further as we do so. As we've heard, Margaret's life took an unexpected change in 1978 when she married Dave. He retired in 1980 from his ministry here at Mount Albert. Margaret became an honorary associate minister here for 10 years. And then during that period, she became moderator of the General Assembly. Interestingly, her grandfather's cousin, who was John Guthrie Wood Aitken, described in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography as merchant, mayor, politician and churchman, was the first lay moderator of the Presbyterian Church. And it was 70 years exactly after his service in 1917 as moderator that Margaret became moderator, another first. That resulted in Dave becoming the moderator's husband. Only Howard Anderson had experienced that role before. The usual expression, of course, was the moderator's lady for the spouse of the moderator. They were a great team. I remember being at the Assembly in 1986 when Margaret was elected as moderator, and she said that she didn't like party labels. On some issues, she said they would find her conservative. On others, she would be radical. In some areas of theology, she would be liberal. In other areas, she would be evangelical. Margaret brought a wonderful, rich blend which enabled her to relate to people across the theological spectrum. She was committed to working across the theological, denominational, and cultural divides. In her work with parish development and mission in Auckland during the tempestuous 1980s, she enabled others to find their voice. The 1983 booklet, Finding the Way, which she edited, had 38 contributors answering the question, what does it mean to be Christian in New Zealand today? In her preface, she noted that the book is deliberately diverse, even provocative, and some voices are critical. She didn't avoid hard questions, facing a church still coming to terms with racial diversity, diminishing membership, the search for a contemporary spirituality, the costly obedience for human rights, a church torn by polarised opinions. The Methodist Church leader Norman Brooks, who is here today, worked closely with Margaret for the best part of 10 years, and he describes her as the guiding light behind the Christian Research Association, which was formed in 1992 out of the Presbyterian Research Group. And here I think something of Margaret the scientist, who had a desire to undertake research, her interest in statistical inquiry, and a desire to try to understand and improve the witness of the church. This came to bear fruit. Norman describes how Margaret encouraged the research of matters relating to the environment, to bicultural and multicultural aspects of our society, to the place and mission of the small church, among others. Under her leadership, the Christian Research Association published a broadsheet every few months, sharing its findings, and a series of booklets which she usually edited. She oversaw the publication of Jemima Tiatia's groundbreaking study, Caught Between Cultures, which explored the way in which Pacific Island youth were caught between the European Palangi dominant culture and their traditional island church family commitments and responsibilities. She was also somebody who was very involved in the Church Life Survey, which Norman also participated in. And he mentioned how the first of those surveys surveyed 14 denominations and produced 75,000 questionnaires, the largest and most comprehensive survey of the churches ever undertaken in New Zealand. And he comments that without Margaret's support, the Church Life Survey in New Zealand and its ongoing work would never have happened. While Margaret was never inducted into a parish, she was an enthusiastic minister of word and sacrament. As moderator of the Wellington Presbytery in 1975, she made herself available to preach in every parish. And we've heard of the way in which she continued to preach into her 90s. She was enthusiastic. While Mount Albert was Margaret's spiritual home, she also for many years regularly attended the Wednesday communion service at St Luke's in Remuera, the church I attend. Margaret, in this unspoken way, was very affirming of the ministry of the late David Clark, who had come out as a gay man and felt deeply the church's rejections of homosexuals. And now to the very. When she finished her term as moderator of the Assembly, Margaret requested that the traditional honorific very not be used before Reverend. In fact, I think they passed a motion in the Assembly along those lines. She was, as Pamela indicated, returning to the ministry which she shared with all ordained women and men and didn't want to be differentiated from them. In her instructions for today, however, the very appeared, and so we have honoured that. Her long and fruitful ministry is over. She is rightly very reverend, very revered for her life and ministry among us. The chorus of the hymn which encouraged Margaret to say yes to Dave is something which we can all take inspiration from, with its affirmation of unity and elimination of fear. Jesus, we love you, and so we gather here. Join our hearts in unity and take away all fear. Thanks be to God for Margaret's fearless living the gospel through her lifelong dedication to the service of others. I invite you in a moment of silence to reflect on Margaret, and if it's possible to show the PowerPoint as we have this time of reflection, that would be helpful. Thank you. We come with our prayers of thanksgiving and intercession, and the response to the words, loving God, is we give thanks. Loving God, we give thanks. We give thanks for Margaret's life, the family in which she was nurtured, her embodiment of the deaconess motto, by love serve, her commitment as an educator to share good news. Loving God, we give thanks. For Margaret's ecumenical spirit and promotion of unity, her dedication as minister of word and sacrament, her willingness to give leadership in worship. Loving God, we give thanks. For Margaret's pioneering role as a woman minister and moderator, her encouragement and support of colleagues, her enthusiasm for research to bring new insights and understanding. Loving God, we give thanks. For Margaret's love for Dave and his family, for her own family and their love for her, for those who have cared for Margaret in these last years. Loving God, we give thanks. We pray, as Margaret would want us to, for a world which searches and works for justice and peace, for a church that seeks to promote inclusion, unity, and respect for diversity, for the fair treatment of all peoples, irrespective of gender or race, for equality among women and men, for the end to family violence and promotion of restorative justice, for the acceptance of all people and their needs, whether differently abled or disabled, for the sick and the dying, for the aged and those who care for them. God of compassion and healing, hear these our prayers. Strengthen us in our own work and service. May our discipleship in the way of Jesus be expressed in our prayers and through our lives. Amen. We join together in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins. We forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. We join in the singing of the hymn, Give Thanks for Life.
Amen.
You have come to the end of your journey with us. You will remain with us in our hearts and our memories. We let you go with thankfulness for all that you have meant to us. We do so affirming that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. So with confidence, we commend Margaret into God's keeping. We brought nothing into this world, and we can take nothing from it. We come from the earth, and we return to the earth. The life of Helen, Margaret, Aitken, Martin has come to a close. The body has served the purpose for which it was brought into being. Now, with reverence and honour, we commit Margaret's body to be cremated, freeing the elements which formed it, to return to their source, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and the renewal of creation. We do this in the Christian belief that life and love triumph over death. Let us be still in the presence of God. What has been done has been done. What has not been done has not been done. Let it be. Let our fears of the darkness of the world and our own lives rest in you. Let the quietness of your peace enfold us, all dear to us, and all who have no peace. Let us look expectantly to a new day, new joys, new possibilities. May compassion be seen in our living, kindness to others be seen in our loving, joy and hope be experienced in our celebration of life. Go in the way of Jesus. Go in God. Go in peace. Amen.
Oh, it is raining. They're like having a good chat now.